point only.
Let's not get into peripheral matters. Thank you, Dr. Satyabama, for giving a very comprehensive presentation on the mission and the purpose for which the mission is being established at the Archaeological Survey of India. And she has also given you a fairly good idea of the diversity of heritage, built heritage, non-built heritage, and so on. In this particular context, it is necessary that we look at variety or diverse variety of the heritage resources that we have. And the inference of documentation is that the data that has been collected through explorations and excavations are very, very important resources, heritage resources for researchers and for generating interest in archaeological studies and developing a clear, comprehensive picture of what this country's cultural heritage is about and its range in terms of temporal range and so on and so forth. And when it comes to prehistoric period, the nature of archaeological heritage is very, very complex, unlike the built heritage. There may be varieties, typological varieties, but here in this particular context, these are the landscapes which are very, very important. And landscape is undergoing tremendous change, rapid changes because of developmental activities and so on. And why documentation needs to be comprehensive is because the sites that you discover, that the sites that you visit and when you revisit, the sites that you excavate, and then once you excavate, the site is totally destroyed. So there is no way to go back to those sites to verify the data that you have collected. And the same is the case with respect to explorations, because you have explored and you have identified certain sites, you have collected certain antiquities, and you also made some field notes and so on. But how comprehensive it is and how broad-based it is very important, because the database that you create needs to be useful for all time to come. With that foresight in mind, we need to create a comprehensive data. So that is where methodologies matter very much. And also it is important that we know what we should be looking for when we are carrying out archaeological investigations through exploration, excavation, and so on. So Dr. Madhulika suggested that I should be speaking on nature of prehistoric sites in southern India from a documentary perspective. Having been in the field of archaeology for 50 years or so, I have learned some lessons, and of course I have not been able to use state-of-the-art technologies to document and so on, like the modern-day generation archaeologists. We were basically doing legwork. We were basically documenting the sites and the material content of the sites by studying the topographic maps, by also looking at the resource maps available for the areas where you have been excavating or exploring and so on. But now the technology has facilitated much more advanced way of documenting, and then even minimizing the cost of engaging oneself in field work and excavation and documentation and so on. And it is an important resource for a variety of people belonging to various walks of life, because as has been emphasized, the database that you create should be useful for people of all walks of life, taking into consideration the needs of the common man, needs of the experts who are there in the field of archaeology and so on. Sorry. I'm happy that she has given me a simple topic, and whatever I'm going to present is based on my own experience and general reading of the nature of prehistoric sites across the Indian subcontinent. Of course, we are focusing on southern India, and whether it is southern India, western India, eastern India, or any part of India, the nature of prehistoric landscapes are more or less same, but there may be regional variation in the way, but the cultural content of these sites are more or less uniform across this vast landscape, as we can see here. This is the scheme of my presentation: temporal range of prehistoric sites in southern India, terminological issues, because most of the documentation that is being done in the laboratory or in the mission office, I think it is based on publications, and reports sent by various students, explorers, and excavators, and so on. So you have to, it's not the primary data for you while you are documenting. So field knowledge is equally important, and also the theoretical developments that have taken place since the beginning of prehistoric research in India is also essential. That equipment is essential for you to assess the veracity of the data that is being published and that is being made available currently through the interactions and so on. So, so that is where we have to look at the temporal range. As you all know, the southern India, the peninsular India has the richest prehistoric archaeological heritage and diverse varieties of prehistoric sites across this landmass, and they range in time from 1.7 million years or 1.5 million years to the end of the Iron Age. So this is the vast time span, and also the distributions maps are already available, and a lot of reports have already been published. From these resources, you get a clear idea that there is a very complex variety of data that is available. Needs to be systematically organized to make it meaningful for the user and so on. And then the temporal issues, what I say in terms of temporal terminological issues. See, when you begin to document from earlier publications, the terminologies that have been used to document the sites, nature of sites or variety of sites appear to be outdated. So when we look at the pre-colonial, so the colonial time documents, we come across various terms, that we have temporal span ranging from Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, Megalithic, Iron Age and so on. And the Paleolithic is also subdivided into early Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic, upper Paleolithic, and then Mesolithic, and also Chalcolithic, Neo-Chalcolithic, Neolithic, Chalcolithic. So some of these terms you encounter, but you need to have the basic concept why these terms do occur in the context of various sites that have been documented or reported by archaeologists and so on. So we have to be very clear, because when we go back to the very early reports, when it comes to identifying Paleolithic sites, beginning from Robert Brucefoot to recent decades, we see that there are great many varieties of terms used for identifying these sites. For example, when we did not have adequate evidence to fill the Paleolithic succession in the Indian subcontinent, comparable to the one which has been built for Europe and other parts of Africa and so on, we see that the continuity of evidence, the presence of sites in the Indian subcontinent comparable or filling up the sequence that has been idealized for Europe and Africa is missing in the Indian context. So Paleolithic sites, many of the reports in the Indian Archaeology Review, they simply report a Paleolithic site has been reported there, and it's not very clear what type of artifacts they found there. So it becomes very difficult for the person who will create this database to know what this report, because we heavily depend on what has already been published. I was myself engaged in preparing a gazetteer of prehistoric sites in India, not only peninsular South India. When computer systems were first introduced into Indian archaeology, I was part of the Ford Foundation project on creating a database, or a gazetteer we used to call. Otherwise, we used to have bibliographies published. That was one aspect of the resources for archaeologists working in India. But when we thought of using computer, facilities, we had to sit and look into this literature, especially Ancient India, Indian Archaeology Review, and several other, reports that were published by geologists and archaeologists and so on. So it was so confusing when we read a couple of sentences saying that so and so a river was surveyed, such and such a site at a particular village was identified, and then they did not know what they are reporting. They simply said Paleolithic. And those days, the word Paleolithic only meant early Paleolithic, Acheulean or lower Paleolithic. And when they found that we found Paleolithic tools, perhaps they did not find anything other than hand axe and cleaver and so on, because these were the two important tools that were known to every Indian archaeologist at that point of time. So these type of terms that were used by the people who were reporting their discoveries were really confusing. I did prepare nearly 8,000 sites ranging in time from lower Paleolithic to Iron Age and so on, but we restricted ourselves to Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites, and then we thought, well, once this is standardized, we will be able to look at later sites like Neolithic and Iron Age and so on. But unfortunately, the project did not continue. But that was a very important step initiated by the late Professor V. Mishra, they can call it. And then we learned a lot, the errors in the way in which these reports were sent to the Archaeological Survey of India. And then we started making suggestions to the ASI authorities, this format does not work, it is not comprehensive, this is not the way of reporting sites, why not change the format, broad-base the format, and so on and so forth. But they went to deaf ears, unfortunately. But anyway, we realized at some point of time, yes, we should have done it much earlier and so on. So this mission is such a constructive step initiated by Dr. Babu Rajiv way back in 2007. Since then, I am aware of what is happening here, but the speed with which it was going was a little disappointing, if I am honest in saying this. And I also made several attempts to approach these authorities to even help us. We have a lot of data, and we would like to provide you authentic information and very comprehensive information as far as possible, given our own expertise and experience in making field documentation of these sites and so on. But it did not happen. Even now we are ready. Even after 10 years of retirement, I am ready to work for national mission. I think I approached Dr. Satyabhama. I prepared a note in her office itself, myself and Dr. Vota. She said she had her own administrative problems. We have to wait. Anyway, we are still waiting. And of course, I asked him.
Solve that problem somehow. So you can please.
Yeah, we have to be more friendly.
Yeah.
That is most essential, because we have been talking about synergy during the last 3 or 4 days and how this synergy works, because these people are looking at that side and we are looking at this screen. The authorities are looking at the world and the participants are looking at the wall. And
the biggest problem what we are facing is the finance department, because they want.
I understand all these things, but where is the way out?
Yes.
That is important.
That we have.
See, and we have to compete. No, we have to have global competition to generate databases. That is the most essential required. We have our own constraints, and we understand we are part of it. No doubt, we are also contributing to these constraints that are there already. But the point is, which is the simplest way of getting things done?
Yes.
You see, less paperwork and more technical input. It should be made possible. So these terminologies were creating hell of a problem, and then we prepared a list. Then we had to abandon because its inconsistency was much more glaring than any kind of standard terminologies that we use. So the early Paleolithic sites in some of these early publications were referred to as Series 1. And in some cases they were called only Paleolithic. And those were the days of prehistoric archaeology means only lower Paleolithic, finding hand-axe cleaver assemblages at sites. Even if other varieties of stone artifacts were associated or found in some other context, they were simply thought unimportant. So this kind of lacuna exists in the published literature. So these terminologies were also, standardizing them became very, very common. And then the IAR reports, if you review the reports published a decade ago and the reports that are published now, there is a repetition in terms of visiting the sites, in terms of revisiting sites and claiming new discovery. So these were complicating. So we were not able to get exact number of sites that are there, whether belonging to lower Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic, upper Paleolithic, and so on. So till the terminology that was available for Indian prehistory was the European model, and they had well-defined lower, middle, upper Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, and so on. And there were these, many gaps, geographical gaps in terms of our knowledge of the presence or absence of, cultural sites belonging to these phases and so on. So that was to be filled up. So when they did not find them, they said there is a hiatus, or these typical terms that we use in European free history are not applicable here. So let us call them Series 1 for Lower Paleolithic, Series 2 for Middle Paleolithic, Series 3 for Upper Paleolithic, and then Mesolithic. So the pre-Neolithic fourfold subdivision was the one which was highly standardized for Europe, because there was evidence coming from different sectors of continental Europe and elsewhere, but the African situation was very, very different. So there were some archaeologists who were comparing our Paleolithic succession with the European, and some archaeologists were comparing our evidence, Paleolithic succession, with the African. The Wall River sequence in southern Africa, South Africa was one standard river, terrace sequence which was considered a model, and similar sequences were not found here. And then when we found in 1930s, when D. Terra Patterson began to work in northwestern India, the terminologies they used were very different from the terminologies they were used for peninsular India and so on. So they are a Sogdian complex and Madrasian complex, and then you have the early Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, Late Stone in Africa, and then early Paleolithic, Middle Paleolithic, Upper Paleolithic in Europe and so on. So but then there was the idea that is a global unity. The Paleolithic period is a global unity. It did not exist at that point of time. They said there is some regional variation, and then we have to have our own models for documenting our evidence and so on. And then subsequently, post-independence period, intensity of surveys and also a focus on excavating not historical and proto-historical sites shifted to even prehistoric sites like Mesolithic sites. Many Paleolithic sites were excavated. Thanks to Dr. Gudrun Corwin, who was the first to excavate a lower Paleolithic site anywhere in India, and her documentation became a standard way of looking at these Paleolithic landscapes, and the methodology she used to describe became very, very useful for some of us who were successor to what Dr. Gudrun Corwin has had done in the Raura Valley and so on. So the terminologies were not same, and so the gaps were to be filled, and so more areas were to be taken up for survey, and then of course reporting presence and absence of types. And then in the 60s, when many archaeologists who had inclination towards European model, they were very keen on finding the gap of Upper Paleolithic in India. So whether we have Upper Paleolithic in India or not was to be supported. One school of thought that yes, there is a scope for finding Upper Paleolithic. Another school of thought said no, we don't have Upper Paleolithic in India comparable to the European. So we should go to African model and follow that particular scheme from early Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, and Late Stone Age. Early Stone Age is early Paleolithic, Middle Stone Age is Middle and Upper Paleolithic, and Late Stone Age is Mesolithic, and so on. And then it was also accepted that we should follow this methodology. So some of the publications, if you come across, even the textbooks that were written, they have this kind of scheme. African terminology was used for describing the development of prehistoric cultures in India and so on. And in the 60s, mid-60s and little later, some sites which were comparable to the European Upper Paleolithic came to be identified, and there was a fresh attempt at returning to European framework of describing our culture, the Paleolithic succession into lower, middle, upper, and so on and so forth. But in the last couple of decades, since the excavation of the site of Patne by S.S. Ali of the ASI, he discovered microliths going back to nearly 30,000 years, and then he called it Upper Paleolithic. Now the Upper Paleolithic typology, of those sites which were found in southern India and the Upper Paleolithic which were found in Tapi Valley were very different. One is a microlithic assemblage, another is a blade tool assemblage. I mean, parallel-sided, elongated blade tools comparable to the European and so on. So this confusion again arose, and then unfortunately, what was published by S.S. Ali remained in isolation. Very unfortunately, and that was a very important finding. And then by the time we also had similar sites in Sri Lanka, microliths going back to 30,000 years. Even in Sri Lanka, these microliths have been dated further back in time up to about 48,000 and so on. And then what happened until about the beginning of 21st century,
all the sites were known to be, containing microlithic assemblages, blade to microblade assemblages coming from later Pleistocene deposits. And then, it was necessary to identify more sites and establish whether our microliths go back in time to the later Pleistocene or not. But what was important was, identify the potential areas and look for similar sites and then identify their presence and so on. And we were fortunate that when we excavated after Patna, the next site which yielded stratified context of microliths going back to 40,000 years was Jwalapuram. And that is where we had to rethink, how do we describe our Paleolithic succession? Whether we use lower, middle, upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic, or we use early Stone Age, middle Stone Age, late Stone Age, or we think of a new scheme of terms like early Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic and late Paleolithic. Late Paleolithic will extend back in time up to about 50 to 60,000 years ago based on investigations at Patna, Jwalapuram, Mehta-Kedi, and then some of these sites in Bengal, Mahadevpura, Khana, and so on and so forth. So there are very few sites, but yet they have given us a clear picture that yes, the upper Paleolithic in the Indian subcontinent is different from the upper Paleolithic in Europe, and their comparability with the African evidence, which is associated with the emergence of modern humans, or what we call Homo sapiens, and so on and so forth. And this information is not incorporated in the publications. That is one thing which is going to miss. So if your database has to be useful, we have to have oblique, early Paleolithic, Acheulean, mode 1. Then also you say this is, Andas cleaver complex, techno-complex and things like that. So these terms have to be put together because the experts are documenting, creating the database, and they can't use the terminology which has been published 40 years ago. They have to update those terms. You have to give an option to the user that this is what it means by Paleolithic, or whether it means lower Paleolithic at that point of time, we need to specify. And then we see, yes, there are these mode 1 Acheulean, mode 2 Acheulean, because we are yet to document mode 1, older one in the Indian subcontinent. So we have to think in terms of the standardization of terms. Mode 1, mode 2, mode 3 is much more non-committal. It does not confuse, and it has been very well defined. But unfortunately, it is not widely used. But we still continue to use the same traditional terminologies and so on. Sorry, and this database needs to take care of this variation in the way in which different terms, meaning the one and the same, have been used at different points of time and so on. And then of course with Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and then Megalithic, Iron Age and all, there is not much confusion, but there is certain doubts about whether whether in the later prehistoric period we have, of course definitely we have a Neolithic phase, whether we have Neolithic Chalcolithic phase. They have identified, because at some of the excavated sites they were able to identify there is an overlap phase. It is difficult to understand what is meant by overlap phase, and it is also difficult to understand what is transition from lower, middle, upper Paleolithic and so on. But the documents, they simply use the term overlap phase and things suggesting that it's an intrusion into the site by yet another group of people who came with a different technology and established their settlement and so. These confusions have to be, in a column called remarks, have to be entered into the database and so on. So we have large number of lower Paleolithic sites in comparison with the number of middle Paleolithic sites that have been documented so far. But as we know, wherever we have lower Paleolithic site, they are associated, they have continued into the middle Paleolithic period. The distinctive or independent middle Paleolithics are not known from many sites, but there may be here and there, that is definitely there. But this is a very complex situation to separate lower Paleolithic and then middle Paleolithic, because there is a continuity from lower to middle Paleolithic, and that is where we transition in technology, typology, and then behavior, human behavior, and so on. And so this aspect of behavioral change needs to be documented along with the information that is available there. And then Upper Paleolithic is a very complex situation. It needs to be addressed very, very carefully, whether we call it Late Paleolithic, whether it is Upper Paleolithic is typically characterized by the first appearance of microblade technology in the Indian subcontinent, and whether earlier many of the sites wherever they found microlithic tools, they were identified as Mesolithic sites. But all Mesolithic sites may not be Mesolithic sites at all. They may have much greater antiquity, and that possibility is very much there. But then it can be expected, given the fact the report gives you a clear idea of the stratigraphical context and also quaternary sequence, in the region where these sites have been located. And that needs to be, if they come from later Pleistocene, there are two levels. One is early part of the late Pleistocene, you may have typical Upper Paleolithic microblade assemblages, and then come upwards towards the terminal Pleistocene, you have Epipaleolithic, but they are not all over. But there are some sites, some regions where we have Epipaleolithic different from what we see in terms of early microblade assemblages and so on. And then Mesolithic sites, there's a wide variety of Mesolithic sites. They are mostly palimpsests in open air landscapes. But when it comes to rock shelter sites, they are intact, they are primary context. And of course, we have clear picture of the thing. But then those rock shelter sites which are considered primary and well stratified sites needs to be reinvestigated to establish whether these microliths found in the rock shelter areas are Mesolithic sites or even earlier. This is a possibility. The database needs to have a question mark. Rock shelters are likely that they are late Pleistocene in most of the time. And of course, all the painted rock shelters, the rock art body at many of these Mesolithic, so-called Mesolithic rock shelters have been identified as Mesolithic rock art. And we have seen in southern India in the recent past that some of these painted rock shelters go back to later Pleistocene. And we may not be able to directly date the rock art, but the context in which the rock art were produced certainly gives us an idea that they go back to Upper Paleolithic in India, which is otherwise not very well known. Everyone argued, yes, we don't have typical Upper Paleolithic means European. Upper Paleolithic art means European rock art. This kind of notions were there, and so I think we have to come out of all these limitations and then create a database which makes it more meaningful to the user and so on. And then of course Mesolithic sites Neolithic sites are widespread in peninsular South India. In the western part of peninsular South India, of course Western India is not part of this area, but still it is part of the southern Indian landscape. We have distinctive agro-pastoral settlements which have been identified as Chalcolithic settlements and so on. And then that Chalcolithic tradition is being described as independent of the Neolithic that was, the Neolithic way of life that was developing in the adjacent region in peninsular South India. And so we are not very clear whether Jorwe culture is a distinctive Chalcolithic culture or it is something related to the late Neolithic in peninsular South India. There is a lot of common, material cultural similarities between Jorwe and the late Neolithic in peninsular Deccan and so on. So whether we should use the term Chalcolithic to describe the succession of Malwa Jorwe cultures in Western India, and then look at the Neolithic's, temporal span of the Neolithic in terms of subdividing the Neolithic into various stages of development. In the beginning it was thought that the ash mound tradition, because the Neolithic sites in South India have a dichotomy. There are ash mounds which are, the mounds created by deliberately accumulated cattle dung and set on fire. And then they were discovered from 1802 onwards, and there were couple of hundred ash mounds. Now if you go back and look at the earlier publications and look at what has been preserved across the landscape, there's a big difference in terms of number. Many of these, several of these sites have been lost for various reasons. And so we have to make sure that these ash mounds, whether they represent, if you go to the early literature on the Neolithic of southern India, the ash mound tradition was thought of as the earliest phase of the transition from hunting gathering to Neolithic agricultural way of life. So now we know, in the recent research in the last 2-3 decades, a lot of new insights have been developed, new investigations have contributed, especially the dating has facilitated a rethinking on the nature of these development of Neolithic way of life in southern India. So we don't think that, as Alchin reported, the early phase is characterized by the ash mound tradition, and then the later phase introduction of copper metal, and they call it Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and then transition to Iron Age and so on. But this is not valid anymore, because we have seen this AMS dating and luminescence dating has helped us in identifying the fact that these ash mounds were not built at a particular point of time, either in the early phase or in the middle phase and so on. Some stratified sites like Vatgal, one of the oldest Neolithic in the sense in terms of antiquity of Neolithic phase in that particular site, has very clearly indicated that the beginnings may go back to 3000 BC. Otherwise, it was generally thought that 2500 BC was the time period when the ash mound tradition Neolithic came into existence across the Deccan area and so on. But the Vatgal excavation has given clues that there is pre-2700 BC Neolithic phase in that area. Most of the sites that have been excavated across peninsular Deccan, whether it is southeastern part of the Deccan volcanic province or the Bhima Basin and then the peninsular gneissic landscapes, we see there is a diversity in the way in which these Neolithic sites are located. And when the dating of several of these ash mounds were carried out, we were able to reconstruct the life histories of these ash mounds. Some ash mounds were built over a period of 100 years, some over a period of 150 years, 200 years, and some over a period of 500 years. And then the beginning of ash mound at a particular locality was not one and the same when compared to the ash mounds at other sites. So they were built at different times at different localities. And then we also found out that these ash mounds represent the earliest phase in terms of beginning of a settlement at that particular locality. So this kind of information needs to be incorporated into this. The radiocarbon chronology has been very, very helpful in resolving some of these issues. And then we have redrawn the scheme of development that, within the peninsular mid-Deccan, where we have widespread occurrence of these Neolithic sites in this region, there are 3 or 4 traditions geographically, identified, demarcatable. So we have the central portion of the Deccan region where we have Neolithic sites of the ash mound tradition, and they range in time. They have a time span from 2500 BC to 1200 BC. Otherwise, they were to be the earliest settlements anywhere in South India. And then we see an area covering the distribution of these ash mounds has been demarcated. Outside this boundary area, we have different traditions without the ash mound being part of the cultural practices of the Neolithic people. There were certainly agro-pastoral communities, and material culturally they were comparable, but this conspicuous absence of building the constructing the ash mound. Why these ash mounds were constructed, there are multiple perspectives. We shall not go into detail. But then what is important now is that we have to look at these investigations that have been carried out at different points of time. There is progression in the way in which we have understood our past, especially the Neolithic past and so on. So stratified sites are quite a few, and then Neolithic sites have topographical location of these Neolithic sites varies from one sector of mid-Deccan to another sector in the mid-Deccan. If you go, there are very few sites along the banks of the rivers, unlike the North Indian Chalcolithic sites or protohistoric sites. These sites are part and parcel of Neolithic inselberg tops, and this is an area which is not covered by even ephemeral streams even today. And in the past also, there is no clue to identifying the existence of drainage in the past, paleo drainage and so on. So for that we had to find answers. So why these settlements are located on tops of the granitic hills, what was the water source, and how this landscape surrounding the hills where the settlements were located was supporting their agricultural activity, economic activity. So this needs to be taken into account. So the water source was very, very different, and the sites were deliberately located on tops of these granitic hills, because granitic hills, as you go back in time, they were having numerous springs, perennial springs. So when compared to the river systems or drainage network and then the location of sites, the Neolithic sites which were located on tops of granitic hills are much more well watered than those which were closer to the channels and so on, because the channels dry up in the post-monsoon season, whereas the springs never dry up, and the water tables were so high, and the hillsides, for certain geological contexts, of different varieties of rocks which make up the Inselbergs, were facilitating formation of springs and so on. This information is lacking from publications. It needs to be taken into account. And there are some sites which are away from these hills or in the valleys, and they are located in black soil areas, and they are located in resource areas, other resources like mineral resources, especially because Neolithic is characterized diagnostic type, like for Paleolithic we say hand axe and cleaver. Here it is celt. Now the celts were manufactured in much more larger quantities towards the end of the Neolithic phase. So whenever we found a Neolithic celt, we think that it is a Neolithic site. So they have a long, temporal span. So finding a Neolithic celt does not necessarily mean that we have found a Neolithic context here. It may be Neolithic or it may be even later and so on. At Sanganakalu, we found that stone axes, polished stone axes were manufactured to the late phase of the Neolithic. Late phase, towards the end of the Ashmount phase tradition. So if the sites are described as Neolithic sites in the literature, we have to look at the data that is being published very carefully and see the geological context and also geomorphological context in which these artifacts are occurring. And then what other material cultural remains are associated with stone steps and so on. So this problem is being addressed by archaeologists in Tamil Nadu. I see that fresh surveys or intensive surveys are taken up. And I'm sure there will be much more clearer understanding of whether the sites mean only Neolithic or something else and so on. So then when, of course, with megalithic context, there's not much confusion amongst us. Either they are associated with the early use of iron or production of iron artifacts, or there is a pre-iron Iron Age which is reflected in the megalithic burials. In all megalithic burials we don't come across iron artifacts, unlike the stratified contexts like Dramerigi and so on. But in the absence of radiocarbon dating, they were equated. Iron Age and megalithic are one and the same and so on. So that concept has been continued into later times, and then we see these use of these terms as interchangeable and so on. But that may not be the case always. We have to have the clear radiocarbon age for the site and the context in which these artifacts are being found. And most distinctive development in the beginning of Iron Age is wheel-made black and red ware. Bichrome pottery does not exist in the pre-Iron Age context anywhere in South India. So the stratigraphical succession is very, very clear, but all sites do not have a long settlement history. Culture history of these settlements varies from one topographic region to another topographic region. For example, Brahmagiri has this clear succession up to early historic period, but 30 kilometers south of Brahmagiri is the Sanganakalu complex, where V. Subbarao excavated. There he could not locate the early historic period, but then he suspected the presence of pre-Neolithic there. But then that observation of existence of pre-Neolithic was conditioned by the nature of excavation he had carried out, because the Wheeler syndrome was they excavate vertically to reconstruct culture history of an ancient settlement, or horizontally to reconstruct the layout of the settlement and so on. But then the pre-Neolithic contexts were established. But later investigations revealed that the so-called pre-Neolithic was not necessarily a pre-Neolithic occupation there. It was part and parcel of the Neolithic itself, stone axe manufacturing industry. And we are very sure that there's no definite example that Middle Paleolithic or pre-Neolithic tools were made from dolerite raw material or gabbro raw material. And then the typology of those plate tools which were found described as pre-Neolithic is not comparable to the the Middle Paleolithic from other parts of India. Middle Paleolithic tools were made from crystalline silica mineral rocks and so on. But anyway, we have to have this clear perspective of the confusion that is there. So unless we go into these details about the terminologies that have been used in different parts of peninsular India at different points of time and so on. And then we have to look at the geomorphic context, because we have to understand why the settlements are situated where they are. Because it's not that site exists accidentally there. Say the geomorphic factors, the environmental factors, the resources available for these life phase of the Neolithic people or megalithic people, hunter-gatherers and so on. So look at the natural environment in terms of it facilitating human occupation at a particular time period, whether it is early Paleolithic, Middle Paleolithic and so on. And so the hunter-gatherers required different natural resources. Early agropastoral communities require different natural resources and so on. So to what extent you can go back in time and reconstruct the paleogeography and the environmental context in which these cultures were emerging and so on and so forth. Sorry. Is there a page down? Sorry, page down. Okay. So the context in which we find sites located in terms of what has been reported by various scholars can be identified as sites belonging to the alluvial context. Then we have high-level gravel sites. These high-level gravels are known from various river basins from central India to southern India, and then they were not known to be potential sites for Paleolithic research. But then in the 1970s, Dr. Padaya laid the foundation. He had that perspective that we should look at these gravels in terms of the potential for identifying the presence or absence of hominins in that area. And so here, the high-level gravels were found, places where Middle Paleolithic or Middle Stone Age, human occupation took place, and the gravels provided ready material for making Middle Paleolithic flake tools and so on. And the Shorapur, Doab, and in the Middle Krishna region and in the Mahanadi and in Narmada Valley, everywhere they began to identify these high-level gravels, and they are called high-level gravels. They are because they lie above the reach of the modern-day floods. Otherwise, river gravels are part and parcel of the sections that are exposed along the banks of various rivers and so on. And then we look at these sites context in terms of most of the early Paleolithic sites are associated with gravel 1, Middle Paleolithic sites associated with gravel 2, and then Upper Paleolithic gravel 3 and so on. This succession of gravel silt were identified since the 1930s, and in 1950s and 60s, Dr. Sankalia standardized this sequence that these river gravels bed load streams and then suspended load streams. But then whether they are really bed load streams or suspended load streams needs to be assessed from the point of view of fluvial geomorphology. The landscape, whether it has such a gradient which will support the formation of bed load streams, whether these hydrological regimes in the past were as powerful to lay such heavy coarser gravel deposits and so on and so forth. This needs to be critically looked at. They have been associated with bed load streams and suspended load streams and so on, but that may not be correct if I have to say it very categorically, because we need to understand fluvial geomorphology to describe the context in which Paleolithic sites have been found and so on. We also have sites associated with hill slopes and hilltops where we have raw material like quartzite, sandstone, limestone and so on. And then some of these rocky landscapes were ideal, and then wherever you have colluvial deposits, and then if you have associated Paleolithic material with these colluvial deposits, you may not find any evidence of perennial water source in the body. But the colluvial deposits generally indicate that in former times there was sufficient water in the area where the colluvial deposits exist now. And then it was easy for them to pick up these cobbles and pebbles from the colluvial deposits, and then they had access to fresh water in that area. So the landscape has to be reconstructed. So many of the sites which are found to be associated with river gravels, whether in the Malaprabha Valley or Ghataprabha Valley, if you look back, they were originally alluvial flats, but they have been identified as gravel 1 because the river has exposed a section where you have gravel 1, silt 1, gravel 2, silt 2 and so on. But then if you look back at the competence of the river, whether it can carry that much load, if there is sufficient hydrological regime to transport heavy coarser load in the past. So that we have now clear framework of paleoclimate cycles prevailing in this area. This is basically a monsoon region, and then how monsoon fluctuations have also governed the formation of habitats in this area, and then these gravels, colluvial or regolith and all that needs to be very carefully looked at. We have to place them against the topography, and then of course they are the sources of raw material. Colluvial deposits or alluvial conglomerates, they are certainly source of raw material. Conglomerates are also the places where springs existed in the past, and colluvial deposits are the places which occur at the base of the hills and so on. They were also places where perennial pools and ponds existed. So riverine network did not play a very important role in the stable environment of peninsular India. So we need to revisit some of these sites and then understand the context very carefully, and then indicate the possibility of finding new ways of describing these and so on. And then there are some sites which are associated with regoliths because it is in situ weathering of the bedrock which has given rise to a deposit which was actually later it was occupied. There is no temporal contemporaneity with the formation of the colluvium or regolith and the human occupation there, because there is a big time difference between the formation of colluvium and human expansion into that area and so on. And then we have fossil springs. Wherever water tables were high, there were springs, and when water tables were going down, springs were drying up. And this drying up is represented by precipitation of spring tufa in the crevices and fissures, in the hilly landscapes and so on and so forth. So sites associated with fossil springs is one category that I can identify. And then we have hilltop sites. Hilltop sites are not only peculiar to the Neolithic. In Kalavgi Basin, we have some of these sites. Plateau surfaces were also, inhabited by these hunter-gatherers and so on. And then of course the famous quarry site or a workshop site, the Nisampur site is one of the best examples, or perhaps the example of a quarry site anywhere in the old world. And these sites are not many, but they are refit. You can refit, the habitats can be put together into the original block and so on. So there are examples where Dr. Shanti has been working, and the site of Nisampur is another site, and which has also been dated to 1.2 million years, and is both quarry site and a workshop. The processing sequence can be constructed right from the point of procuring raw material to finishing the artifact, and then the habitat being left in the place of manufacture and so on. And there are sites which are part of the rock outcrops, and you don't get a well-preserved site there, but we get scattered evidence of presence of artifacts of the Paleolithic or Mesolithic or anywhere. And then the laterites, these are relic landscapes in the inland regions of peninsular India. But as you go westwards towards Western Ghats and then towards the western coast, we come across dense scatter of microlithic tools, because they are surface sites where no way of dating them. But then we can now think of going back, and then whenever we encounter sites associated with lateritic surfaces, we may have to find a way to identify, because we have now very clear understanding of typo-technological development from later Pleistocene to Holocene, early Middle Holocene and so on. And then we have plough zone sites. Most of these high-level gravel sites are in the plough zone context. They have not been disturbed to the extent, the sites which have been reported from river valleys or riverbed sites and so on. But they are really in situ in terms of point provenance and spot provenance. We can identify the integrity of these sites associated with rock outcrops and plough zone sites. The high-level gravels are the best examples where it can be ascertained to what extent the sites are in the primary context also. Then of course coastal sites. In the west coast we do not have clear evidence, but eastern coast is very, southeast coast of India and Andhra coast and all, we have large number of coastal sites ranging in time from early Paleolithic onwards. And then of course numerous rock shelters, and for a long time it was thought that only central India has painted rock shelter sites, but they are widespread. Wherever we have these Proterozoic basins, whether it is Vindhyas, Kadampas, Kalabgis, we have these rock shelters because the natural processes have given rise to formation of rock shelters. And then these rock shelters are formed in quartzite, sandstone, and so on. And then these are potential areas because they are not only rock shelters, they also have basic raw material, lithic raw material resources. And they were certainly inhabited by these hunter-gatherers, and even later. So in the Vindhyas, you have a continuity right from early Paleolithic to historical times and so on. And then, of course, in coastal regions, you have the theory sites, which are being addressed by Dr. Papu's team. And then, of course, cave sites are there. And we thought most of these Neolithic sites are open-air habitations. But we have come across Neolithic cave sites in Kadapa Basin, this sub-basin of Kurnool area. So we do have a category of Neolithic sites where caves were occupied, and these caves are located in those ecosystems where seasonal plant food resources were available, and that is one reason we have these cave occupations taking place during the Neolithic time as well. So then we have Chet Brescia sites. We come across Chet Brescia across these rocky landscapes in the Kalanki Basin. And then presence of Chet Brescia is one clue for us to, identify the existence of a fossil spring. And then in and around the Chet Brescia region, we have come across the presence of hunter-gatherer sites of the Paleolithic, early Paleolithic, and so on. So this is the sequence. If you look at some of the stages, processing sequence, I should not go into very relevant to you, but then these are the stages in which the final product is produced, and then they occur in the context of a workshop or a what we call a quarry site and so on, and they need to be taken into account. You may have to ask this question to the person who has published the information. And also, if you can interact with these people, if they are published and the person is not available now, I think you may have to visit the sites to reconfirm whether the context that has been described is, correct or not. This is one example of a hill slope site, and the entire landscape is littered with Paleolithic artifacts. It's a palimpsest kind of a situation because the same raw material was used at various points of time. We have Acheulean artifacts, we have Middle Paleolithic artifacts, but then we don't have Upper Paleolithic artifacts. But there's the longitudinal profile from hilltop to the the pediment surface needs to be drawn in the field, and then the context and the distribution or scatter of artifacts need to be plotted, and that helps in the way in which these landscapes were utilized by the inhabitants or the hunter-gatherers adapting to this particular landscape and so on. And stratified sites and or some of these examples, these are shallow river basin called Joreru River, where we have found the presence of volcanic ash in a stratified context. That is one thing. And we have also found artifacts below and above this particular ash layer. And ash is dated to 74,000 years ago. And the ash deposits material remains below the ash are certainly contemporary with the ashfall, and the artifacts above the ash, ash deposit is certainly post-deposition and so on. But then the temporal gap between the deposits below the ash and the deposits above the ash needs to be assessed. And of course, now we have wonderful geochronological methods which help us in resolving some of these issues of chronology and temporality of these sites and so on. Although this is a 2-meter deposit, the original thickness of the ash is not more than 15 centimeters or so. There is a lot of emplacement which has taken place, and there it has given rise to this artificial thickness. So we found Middle Paleolithic tools below the ash and continuation of Middle Paleolithic, and at some point of time, Middle Paleolithic comes to an end, and we have rock shelters providing evidence of late hunter-gatherers, colonizing this area. I don't go into those areas. And this is one example of a stratified context site in peninsular South India, and the colluvium and the bedrock, and the weathered bedrock that you see. And most of these colluvia have these cobbles and angular pebbles and tabular pebbles which are readily available for these Acheulean or Middle Paleolithic communities, and they were able to utilize this landscape, provided the region also supported their economic subsistence requirements and so on. This is another context we come across, and then the outcrops, whether it is the Isampur limestone outcrop or the Kaladgi quartzitic outcrop. So quarrying of blocks of this raw material was carried out, and they were transported to some distance, and then they were modified into many tools and so on. And then I was talking about this church breccia. This is a very rocky landscape in a part of Kaladgi basin where we don't have scope for water to collect on the landscape. There are no shallow pools and ponds. Of course, nowadays we don't see that because the landscape modification for agricultural activity has taken place. But then each site needs to be, documented in the way it has been done here. So these various landscape features and these deposits that we see helped us in understanding, because this is a land which is covered by Kaladgi bedrock, and then we say, of course, it is not a very, it's a folded kind of situation. The bedrock is not horizontal yet, but then within the folded Kaladgi series of rocks, we have this church breccia. And the presence was important because in and around this particular hill slope, we have thousands and thousands of Acheulean hand axes and cleavers and so on. But there is no river anywhere, and the landscape does not give us a clue that there was a perennial water source in this area. But when we were able to identify church breccia, we were sure that there was ancient spring activity in this area, and this spring activity dried up, and the reddish sediment, spherical sediment, was capped by tufa, spring tufa and so on. So that kind of understanding of environmental change is essential, and that helps us in identifying why the site was situated where they are. So I was simply reporting is there are sites here, there are sites here. The sites have yielded so many number of hand axes, so many number of cleavers and so on. Does not make much sense. Perhaps this kind of information should also help other sites to be revisited and looked at from this perspective and so on. The best example of a quarry site in Karnataka region is this Isampur quarry, and the entire reduction sequence can be reconstructed there. It has been documented, and then the blocks of limestone were detached from outcrops, and then the pyramidal flakes were detached, and each of these large flake was modified into biface and so on and so forth. Another view of the Middle Paleolithic stratified site, very few in India, known from different parts of peninsular South India. I'm not touching upon the work carried out by Dr. Shanti Papu, but she will be talking more about the sites she has been investigating in Tamil Nadu. So this is another context, stratified context of a Middle Paleolithic site. And then the rock shelters, painted rock shelters, and you can see the entire landscape from base to the range, hill range to the plateau. There are hundreds of rock shelters, and each one has a painting, if not multiple phases of painting, but at least one or two imageries are seen on each one of these. So that was an exciting thing. But nowhere in the literature we come across, even today, archaeologists working in Andhra Pradesh, they are not aware, in spite of the fact that this has been published. And then if they are available on a national database, and if they can have access to this database, they will know where to go back and then survey. And then, do I have time? It should complete. Go ahead. I think it's last slide. Rock shelter excavation, as I said in the beginning, has given us a well-dated evidence for microliths going back to 40,000 years or so. And then the caves, which were first discovered by Captain Newbold, later excavated by the Foods, and then geologists, paleontologists, and archaeologists have been going there and then discovered evidence. But recent work, we have been able to document the presence of rock art and also presence of Neolithic occupation. We could not go deeper to the base of the floor, but it is a potential area because rock shelters and caves have very thick deposits and it takes decades to go to the bottom of the cave floor. So it needs to be continued. But anyway, we have a very good temporal control, temporal framework for the cave floor deposits. Nearly 200,000 years of sequence has been reconstructed where varieties of paleontological remains, archaeological remains and rock art and related vestiges of human activity have been documented from here. Then Neolithic rock art is as abundant as the painted rock shelters across this landscape. A lot of investigations, a lot of documentation and interpretation of this nature and variety of rock art associated with agro-pastoral communities has been carried out, and there is much more scope for continuing research on this aspect of the Neolithic and so on. And then why should we document? Is because the developmental activities are consuming ancient sites, because these are landscapes, these are not built heritage, landmarks and so on. So they are part of the landscape. They are not easily visible to the common man, and these are economic resources in modern time. So granite quarrying is a lot of money, like iron ore mining, granite mining is picked up all over peninsular India. So when we found that this is happening, and this is one of the most well-researched site, Neolithic site anywhere in southern India. So we thought we should do, and fortunately for us, there was good response from the district administration. We were able to arrest this mining activity, and salvage, archaeology could be carried out, and that was one major success that we were able to achieve. And then this is the kind of landscape associated with Neolithic hilltop sites and rock art on the hilltop and several other varieties and so on. This is another example. This is the ash mound, which was first discovered in 1802 by Colin Mackenzie, and that photograph is the present condition, and which is being developed as a national monument. Nobody has declared it as an archaeological site, but we call it a national monument. I am sure this will remain forever and ever and so on. Thank you very much.